Hey, it's Rick here, Tropical Smokehouse. We're here in the kitchen at Tropical Barbecue Market. We're running the M&M today where we cook all of our briskets. We're going to do a walkthrough today on basic brisket trim. This is something that there are so many good brisket trim videos already out there. I think that if you've done one, you get the idea of it. We want to talk a little bit about what we think is important for our process and just how we prep our brisket the way that we like. So what we have here are two Demkota Ranch briskets. We work with Demkota in both of our spots. We serve prime brisket at the smokehouse. Here at Tropical Barbecue Market, we serve a choice brisket. We feel that the process and also the smoker allow us to produce a consistently excellent product with choice grade. So we want to take advantage of that because it is a little bit easier on the wallet, especially for the daytime customer that's here several days a week for lunch. So we don't want to overtax them with high grade meat, but we do high quality prep. And I think side by side, Demkota Choice competes with anything on the market. So if you buy a whole brisket, it's going to come in a cryovac bag similar to this. This is a branded bag, but they all will say the grade of the meat on. So if you're buying out of the supermarket, just check. You want to at least find a choice brisket. Prime, sometimes you'll find it. Choice is usually available. It's important for a couple of reasons. Number one is that you want something that's been graded so that you know what the fat content is. And you want to buy what is going to help you succeed. So if you're maybe gaining experience, you want to use prime. It's more forgiving because it's more well marbled. If you know what you're doing and you have a good process and your method is sound, then try to cook a choice brisket and see what the outcome is. You might be very surprised. You don't necessarily need to spend more to get more out of it if your process is good. So what I do typically is I'll take things out of the bag. I'll use just a paper towel to take the excess moisture off of the outside. I do that because I don't want things slippery while I'm cutting. You want to always try to have a dry hand for your knife. You want to keep your board dry so that your meat isn't slippery, and you want to keep your meat dry so that as you're cutting with your left hand, or you're holding with your left hand and cutting with your right, you don't want things that are difficult to hold on to. You want to be able to manipulate the meat easily, and you don't want to have any accidents. So this is I believe a 9-inch semi-stiff curved breaking knife. I spent some time in the kitchen at Interstellar Barbecue in Austin, and this was the knife that they preferred to use for brisket trim. Prior to that, I had used a 10-inch flexible fillet knife from Dexter, which does a really good job, but I'll show you a couple cuts with this knife that this knife just actually, it exceeds a fillet knife for brisket trim. If all you have is a boning knife, you can use it, but this isn't really an expensive knife, and if you cook brisket frequently, I definitely recommend checking this out. So in terms of the brisket anatomy, I have the brisket upside down here. The very first cut that we're going to make is we're going to even up this large piece of hard fat. This actually comes from between the flat muscle and the point muscle, and it's the tallest part of the brisket. Oftentimes, we don't want to carve that fat out and make a giant hole. We just want to make one even clean cut and take the excess off. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to use the whole knife. So I'm going to start on the heel of the knife, and I'm just going to make one nice cut, release that. And this is all hard fat that we would render for tallow. So don't throw that in the trash. That's the best fat to render for tallow. So at this point, we've got that off the back. If you have any heavy stuff like this, you can get it off. We don't spend a lot of time to denude entirely the bottom sides of our brisket. I do see that oftentimes in brisket trim videos where they'll spend a lot of time and energy denuding the entire backside of the brisket. For me, it's like peeling ribs. I've cooked a lot of brisket. I've not seen where that really affects the palatability of the brisket. At this point, we can make a couple other small cuts, but we're going to focus on the major ones. So that's cut number one. At this point, we're going to flip the brisket over. The rest of the anatomy of the brisket is important to understand what we're looking at here. So everybody knows the tall point is the fatty brisket. They call it the point, the tall portion of the brisket rather. And then the shorter half is the flat. The grain of the musculature runs parallel here, and then it's kind of angled here. So it's not quite perpendicular, but this muscle goes that way, this muscle goes up. Because of that, we're going to just make sure that where those two muscles overlap, there's a large amount of fat here and a large amount of fat here. We're going to focus on trimming that. Okay, but the first thing we're going to do is look for what's affectionately known as the mohawk. I'll turn this so that we can get a better camera angle. You see just a little bit of connective tissue there. So the mohawk is basically this flap of meat where the point, which is the best fatty marbled brisket meat, is loose from the rest of the brisket, and it kind of sticks up. If you read about the history of burnt ends, this were the original burnt ends. This one cut would not get trimmed, it would get cooked, and when it would come out of the smoker, this would be crispy, well rendered, and very toothsome. That would get just trimmed before the brisket was sliced, and that is where burnt ends actually comes from. So the first thing that we're going to do, I'll turn this back so I can see now. We're going to make one beveled cut, and we're going to clean that mohawk even with the rest of the brisket, and we're going to bevel the fat that's underneath of it. So I'm going to come up at the top. I'm going to make one sweeping cut, and I'm going to just follow that line down. I'll turn it back so that you can see. So now I have that side. There are going to be a lot of other smaller cuts, but that's the second major one. To clean that up and make sure that I don't have a rough edge on my flat, I'll just hold the knife on the board and just draw it towards me to just round that edge off there. Okay, so that's that side. I'll turn it back. When you cut brisket, it's important to always cut away from yourself as much as possible and never cross your hands and try to be cutting underneath of your other hand. So this side is all fat, okay? And what we want to do is just focus on trimming this heavy fat off. You can see down here on the flat, you've got about 3/4 of an inch of fat there. So we got a good bit we want to remove. And you can actually see more with your hands oftentimes when it comes to meat cutting than you can with your eyes. So I always run my hand down that, and I can gauge the thickness of the fat based on how hard it is, because the fat, especially when it's cold, is much more firm than the meat. So this, I can see that it's no fat there, but also I can tell just by touching it, I don't have much work to do there. Then when I run my hand down this exterior portion, this fat is quite firm and quite thick. So we're going to do a similar cut on this side, where we're going to start up on the tip of the point, and we're just going to make some long sweeping cuts to trim fat all the way down that side. The critical thing is having a sharp knife so that you can actually make decisive deep cuts, so that you can make some nice clean lines like this. If you're going in there with a dull knife, you're going to do a lot of whittling, and you're going to have very uneven cuts, and you're going to see a lot of knife marks. So what you want to aim for as a goal is to be able, and this is where this knife works really well, is this middle portion. The brisket's a little bit thinner there, and the fat is thicker, and I can actually use the curve of the blade to get in there and kind of push that away from myself and very neatly remove that. Do that a couple more times. And now I've made most of that fat less than 1/4 inch. It's like the thickness of a pencil. You can go back and finesse it a little bit. Like I said, there's a lot of minor cuts or small cuts that you can do to go back and really make things 100%. But as far as the major cuts, this is the third one, okay? So The last cut, cut number 4, is we're actually going to trim the flat, and we're going to remove any of the flat, which is lean meat we can use for other purposes like sausage making or burgers. We're going to remove any portion of that flat that we feel is too thin to go through the cooking process. Brisket cook can range from 8 to 14 hours depending on how you're cooking. If it's too thin to go through that without getting overcooked and just dry and not nice, we're going to take it. So on this end, you can see the brisket is about 1.5 inches, 2 inches thick. So that end on this particular brisket of the flat, that's perfect. Now the other corner of it, you can see that we're not working with too much meat there. So we're going to make the 4th cut, and we're actually going to remove that thinnest portion, and we're going to just basically round that off. So on the 4th cut, we'll come in here and just round, pulling towards ourselves, and we're going to remove that thinnest portion and make everything as uniform as possible. So we can see our fat is about 1/4 inch across the board, and we've got at least 1 inch of meat. That'll go through the cook, and it'll still come out nice to where you can slice this brisket from end to end. And that's kind of one of the biggest, plus of trimming the brisket prior to cooking, which is kind of new school barbecue. Old school barbecue would be to cook the whole brisket with everything on it and then clean it as you're carving it. The last thing we're going to do is again use our hands to check everything, make sure we didn't leave any thick fat. If we need to come back, touch it up a little bit, come down here even on the flat. You can have too much fat even on the flat. You don't want to make that flat dry by taking all of the fat, but if you leave so much fat that when you carve it, it's got light unrendered fat, it's not real great. So you want to be consistent with that fat from tip to tip. Got a little bit more there. We're going to make one more bevel cut on this edge like we did on the other side, where I'm just going to put the knife directly on the board and draw it towards myself. Just take that thin ribbon of meat off, clean that edge up. So, first cut, second cut, third cut, 4th cut. There are basically 4 big cuts on a brisket. You can take time and go back and make every piece perfect. Go back and whittle away till your heart's content, but you have to go through those 4 major steps to get this brisket ready for the smoker. The one last thing to note is that where your point comes into your flat, oftentimes you've got a pretty big chunk of fat there, and you've got a pretty big chunk of fat here. In my opinion, it's best to leave most of those, because if you start to go in and whittle them out, you're actually going to separate those 2 muscles, and you're going to create a cavity there that the smoke won't actually get, I should say heat, won't actually get to and render very well. So you're going to have kind of moist, loose meat without bark underneath of there if you start carving too much of that away. What we're really looking to do is make this thing a nice smooth shape that doesn't really have anything sticking out or anything folded over, so that as it cooks, it's going to cook very evenly and develop a nice even bark on the outside. So that's a brisket trim. This baby is ready to season. Back is clean but not too clean. And we'll be carving these on the board here this afternoon for lunch at Tropical Barbecue Market.